The morning sun glinted off the chrome of Maggie's food truck as she stepped out from behind her counter. She wiped her hands on her worn apron, the fabric telling stories of 6 years of hard work and determination. What caught her attention wasn't the usual line of customers waiting for her famous breakfast burritos, but the tense scene unfolding across the street. 2 officers had surrounded a young man on a motorcycle. Their postures weren't just rigid, they were aggressive. The young man, barely 20 by the look of him, kept his eyes down, his shoulders hunched as the officers fired questions at him. "Where'd you get this bike?" one officer demanded, circling the motorcycle like a predator. "Registration seems new. Pretty expensive ride for someone like you." Maggie paused, wooden spoon still in hand. This wasn't her business. The food truck was everything she had, her livelihood, her independence, her dream realized after years of saving every penny. Getting involved meant risk. Other morning commuters walked past, averting their eyes, quickening their pace. No one wanted trouble. No one was willing to step into that dangerous space between authority and accusation. The young man's voice trembled as he tried to explain. The officers cut him off, their tone growing more hostile. One placed a hand on his shoulder, pushing him back against his bike. Something in Maggie's chest tightened. She recognized what was happening, power being wielded simply because it could be. 6 years ago, she'd faced similar intimidation when applying for permits, officials who seemed to enjoy making the process difficult just because they could. Before she fully realized what she was doing, Maggie had crossed the street. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each step taking her further from safety and closer to a confrontation she hadn't planned. "Officers, is there a problem?" Her voice cut through the morning air, steadier than she felt. Both officers turned toward her, their expressions shifting from surprise to anger. The taller one stepped toward her, his badge catching the sunlight. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. I suggest you return to your establishment." The second officer moved closer. "Funny you should mention your establishment. When was your last health inspection? I hear the department's been short-staffed, missing some routine checks." The threat hung in the air between them. Maggie felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. One phone call from them could bring inspectors swarming. Everything she'd built could disappear. But she didn't back down. Not when it mattered most. What happened next would change everything, not just for the young biker, but for Maggie and the entire town of Willow Creek. In those crucial moments, as tension built and onlookers held their breath, Maggie made a choice. A bold, unexpected choice that forced the officers to back down. Minutes later, the young man was free to go, casting a look of profound gratitude toward the food truck owner who had saved him from what was clearly heading toward a disastrous outcome. "Would you risk everything you've worked for to stand up for a stranger?" Stay with me to discover how one woman's bravery in the face of intimidation unleashed an unexpected chain of events. Willow Creek sat nestled between rolling hills and a winding river, a town of contrasts that somehow managed to coexist in relative harmony. The east side boasted renovated Victorian homes and boutique shops with carefully arranged window displays, while the west side featured more modest dwellings and family-owned businesses that had weathered decades of economic ups and downs. Main Street served as the dividing line, not just geographically but socially. The town council meetings often became battlegrounds between those pushing for revitalization and those fighting to preserve Willow Creek's working-class roots. What both sides could agree on, however, was their appreciation for good food served with genuine warmth. That's where Maggie Torres had carved her niche. Parked at the corner of Main and Elm, the blue and white food truck with "Maggie's Meals on Wheels" painted in bold letters had become a town fixture over the past 6 years. The location wasn't random, it sat precisely where East met West, serving everyone from construction workers to bank managers, high school students to retirees. At 42, Maggie carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. Her dark hair was often pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands quick and sure as they assembled orders. The laugh lines around her eyes deepened whenever regular customers approached, many of whom she greeted by name. "Morning, Mrs. Abernathy." "The usual today?" she'd call out, already reaching for the tea and cinnamon roll before the elderly woman could respond. What most customers didn't know was the winding path that had led Maggie to this food truck. Born to Mexican immigrants who had settled in Willow Creek 30 years ago, Maggie had watched her parents work multiple jobs to provide opportunities they'd never had. Her father in construction, her mother cleaning homes and later working at the local diner, they'd instilled in her a work ethic that became the foundation of everything she did. After putting herself through community college with a business degree, Maggie had landed what seemed like her dream job, office manager at Willow Creek's largest employer, Hartman Manufacturing. For 12 years, she'd been the backbone of the operation, the person who kept things running smoothly while executives took the credit. Her co-workers came to her with problems both professional and personal. When the copy machine jammed, they called Maggie. When they needed advice about dealing with difficult clients, they sought Maggie. When they couldn't make rent and needed an advance on their paycheck, they whispered their troubles to Maggie, who would quietly advocate on their behalf. This reputation for fairness and generosity wasn't something she cultivated intentionally, it was simply who she was, values passed down from parents who believed in treating others with dignity regardless of their station in life. "My father always said that kindness costs nothing but means everything," she once explained to a customer who asked why she gave free meals to the homeless man who sometimes lingered near her truck. "And my mother taught me that standing up for what's right is never optional." That philosophy had served her well in many ways, earning her respect throughout Willow Creek. But it had also cost her dearly. The trouble at Hartman Manufacturing began when Maggie discovered discrepancies in the payroll system. Certain employees, primarily women and minorities, were being systematically underpaid compared to their counterparts with similar experience and responsibilities. When she brought this to the attention of upper management, expecting them to correct what must surely be an oversight, she was met with dismissive responses and vague promises to look into it. Part 1, Setting the Stage, remaining 650 words. Weeks passed with no action. The discrepancies continued. Maggie documented everything, gathering evidence, building a case. When she approached management again, this time with detailed spreadsheets and clear patterns of discrimination, the response was swift and severe. "We've decided to restructure the administrative department," her supervisor informed her the following Monday. "Unfortunately, your position has been eliminated." 12 years of dedication ended with a cardboard box of personal items and a severance package that came with a non-disclosure agreement she refused to sign. The official reason for her termination was company restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. She had challenged the system, and the system had pushed back. For 3 months, Maggie applied for jobs throughout Willow Creek, only to find doors mysteriously closed. Hartman Manufacturing's influence ran deep in the small town. References that should have been glowing became vague. Positions that seemed perfect for her qualifications were suddenly filled before she could interview. "It's nothing personal," a former colleague whispered to her at the grocery store. "They're making an example of you." The financial strain mounted. Her savings dwindled. The mortgage payment on her modest home became a monthly source of anxiety. But even in her darkest moments, Maggie refused to regret standing up for what was right. The idea for the food truck came during a sleepless night. Her mother had taught her to cook from an early age, passing down recipes that blended Mexican traditions with American influences. Friends had always raved about her food at gatherings. Why not turn that skill into a business? The logistics weren't simple. Banks were reluctant to loan money to someone who had recently lost her job. But Maggie's reputation in the community proved stronger than corporate influence. A local credit union took a chance on her business plan. A retired mechanic helped her find and refurbish an old truck at a fraction of the usual cost. Former co-workers, the same ones she had fought for, showed up on weekends to help with renovations. 6 years later, Maggie's Meals on Wheels had not only survived but thrived. Her fusion tacos and homemade pastries drew customers from neighboring towns. She'd expanded to catering local events. Most importantly, she'd maintained her independence and her principles. She hired local teenagers for their first jobs, teaching them not just cooking skills but work ethics. She sourced ingredients from local farmers when possible. During tough winter months, she ran a pay-what-you-can day each week, ensuring no one in Willow Creek went hungry due to financial hardship. Food brings people together, she often said. At my counter, everyone's equal. That philosophy extended beyond her business practices. Maggie served on community committees, donated to local causes, and spoke up at town meetings when proposals threatened to disadvantage vulnerable residents. She wasn't a crusader by nature, she simply couldn't stand by when she saw injustice. Which is exactly why, on that fateful morning, she couldn't ignore what was happening to the young man on the motorcycle. The officer's aggressive questioning, the way they cornered him, the obvious intimidation tactics, it triggered memories of her own experience with power being misused. What she didn't realize as she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind her counter was that this particular act of courage would ripple through Willow Creek in ways she could never have anticipated. By sundown the next day, her life, and the town itself, would never be the same. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. Maggie arrived at her usual spot at 5:30 a.m., the sky still dark as she prepped for the breakfast rush. By 7 o'clock, the line had formed, construction workers grabbing coffee and breakfast burritos, office workers picking up orders to take to their desks, parents with children in tow heading to school drop-offs. It was just after 8:30 when the commotion began across the street. Two police cruisers pulled up alongside a young man on a motorcycle who had stopped at the corner gas station. From her serving window, Maggie noticed the officers approach him with a purposefulness that seemed disproportionate to a routine traffic stop. The young man, Jesse Rodriguez, though Maggie didn't know his name yet, had just filled his tank and was putting on his helmet when the officers flanked him on both sides. "That's a nice bike," the taller officer said, his tone making the compliment sound like an accusation. "Where'd you get it?" "I bought it used, sir," Jesse replied, his voice respectful but nervous. "About 6 months ago." "Pretty expensive ride for someone your age," the second officer commented, circling the motorcycle. "Mind if we see some ID and registration?" Jesse complied immediately, reaching slowly for his wallet. As he handed over his license, Maggie noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Rodriguez, huh?" The first officer examined the license. "You're not from around here." "I live in Riverdale, sir. Just passing through on my way to work." The questioning continued, growing more pointed. "Where exactly did he buy the bike? Who sold it to him? How could he afford it? Did he have a receipt? Why was he in this part of town? Did he know there had been reports of a similar motorcycle involved in incidents in neighboring counties?" Each question came faster than the last, giving Jesse little time to answer completely before the next accusation-laced inquiry hit him. The officers positioned themselves to block any potential exit, their body language increasingly aggressive. Around them, Willow Creek continued its morning routine. Customers at the gas station glanced over, then quickly looked away. A woman walking her dog crossed to the opposite sidewalk. A man in a business suit pretended to be deeply engaged with his phone. Maggie recognized the bystander effect in action, that psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help when others are present. Everyone assumed someone else would step in if the situation truly warranted intervention. Everyone feared becoming involved in something potentially dangerous or complicated. Everyone had somewhere to be, responsibilities waiting, reasons to mind their own business. She felt that pull herself. The breakfast rush wasn't over. Orders needed filling. Her livelihood depended on keeping customers happy and fed. Besides, these were police officers, professionals doing their job. Surely they had legitimate reasons for questioning the young man. But as the interrogation continued, something shifted in Maggie's perception. The officers weren't asking questions to gather information, they were making assumptions and looking for confirmation. Their tone wasn't professional but mocking. Their stance wasn't protective but predatory. When one officer placed a hand on Jesse's shoulder and pushed him back against his bike, Maggie's internal debate ended. The wooden spoon she'd been holding clattered to the counter. "I'll be right back," she told her part-time helper, a college student named Miguel. "Maggie, don't," Miguel began, but she was already untying her apron. As she stepped out from behind her counter, memories flooded back, of sitting across from HR at Hartman Manufacturing, of watching doors close in her face during her job search, of feeling powerless against a system designed to protect itself rather than the people it claimed to serve. The 20 steps across the street felt like walking through deep water, each movement requiring conscious effort against the resistance of potential consequences. Her food truck license renewal was coming up. The health inspector could suddenly find violations. The police could make parking in her usual spot difficult. Yet with each step, her resolve strengthened. If not her, then who? If not now, then when? Part 3, The Confrontation, next 700 words. "Officers, is there a problem here?" Maggie's voice cut through the tension, steadier than she expected. Both officers turned, momentarily surprised by the interruption. The taller one, Officer Brennan according to his nameplate, recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this is police business. Please return to your establishment." Maggie stepped closer, positioning herself where Jesse could see her. "I couldn't help noticing you've been questioning this young man for quite some time. He's one of my regular customers." This was a lie. She'd never seen Jesse before, but it changed the dynamic instantly. Jesse's eyes widened slightly, but he had the good sense not to contradict her. "You know him?" Officer Brennan asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "He stops by my truck at least once a week," Maggie continued smoothly. "Always polite, always pays with his card." Another fabrication, but delivered with unwavering confidence. The second officer, shorter with a buzz cut, moved toward her. "This individual is being questioned about a motorcycle that matches the description of one reported stolen." "That's not true," Jesse protested. "I have all the paperwork." "I didn't ask you," the officer snapped. Maggie felt her heart racing but kept her expression neutral. "Has the motorcycle been confirmed as stolen? Have you run the VIN number?" The officers exchanged glances. "We're conducting our investigation, ma'am. Again, I need to ask you to step back." Instead, Maggie took another step forward. "I'd like to know if he's being detained or if he's free to go. Because if he's not being detained, he's going to be late for work, and I'm sure that's not your intention." The confrontation was drawing attention now. A few pedestrians had stopped to watch. Cars slowed as they passed. Still, no one else approached. "This is your final warning," Officer Brennan said, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his taser. "Interfere with police business and you'll be facing obstruction charges." That's when Maggie made a decision that would change everything. She turned away from the officers and faced the growing number of onlookers. "Hey! Everyone! I need witnesses here," she shouted, her voice carrying across the street. "These officers are harassing this young man without cause. I need people to record this." The effect was electric. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted from a private intimidation to a public spectacle. People who had been pretending not to notice now couldn't look away. Several pulled out phones. "What's going on over there?" called a man from the gas station. "They're hassling him about his motorcycle." Maggie called back. "Says it's stolen but he has all the paperwork." More people gathered. A woman from the coffee shop across the street approached, phone held up obviously recording. Two construction workers crossed the street, their presence alone adding weight to Maggie's side. "Ma'am, you're creating a public disturbance," Officer Brennan said, his voice lower now, aware of the audience. "I'm creating accountability," Maggie replied, loud enough for others to hear. "This young man deserves to be treated with respect unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing. Do you?" The shorter officer stepped back, speaking quietly into his radio. Officer Brennan's jaw tightened as he looked around at the growing crowd, many with phones pointed in their direction. "Run his plates," he finally said to his partner. "Check the VIN." The verification took less than 2 minutes. The motorcycle wasn't stolen. The registration matched Jesse's ID. There was no legitimate reason to detain him. "You're free to go," Officer Brennan told Jesse curtly. "Watch your speed in town." As the officers returned to their cruisers, the crowd began to disperse, many nodding approvingly at Maggie or patting her shoulder as they passed. Jesse stood by his motorcycle, visibly shaken. "Thank you," Jesse said, his voice barely audible. "They wouldn't listen to me. I kept trying to show them my paperwork, but they just kept asking more questions, making more accusations." Maggie nodded, her own adrenaline still pumping. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I think so." He glanced at the departing police cruisers. "I don't understand what just happened. I was just getting gas." "What's your name?" Maggie asked. "Jesse. Jesse Rodriguez." "I'm Maggie Torres." She gestured toward her food truck. "You want some coffee? You look like you could use it." Jesse followed her across the street, still looking dazed. As they reached the food truck, several customers approached Maggie, expressing admiration for what she'd done. "That was brave," said an elderly man waiting for his usual egg sandwich. "It was the right thing to do," Maggie replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for Jesse. Inside the truck, Miguel gave her a concerned look. "Boss, you know those officers come here for lunch sometimes. This might cause problems." "Then they can find somewhere else to eat," Maggie said firmly, though the potential consequences were already forming in her mind. As the morning crowd thinned, Jesse sat at one of the small tables Maggie had set up beside her truck. He explained that he worked as a mechanic in Riverdale, having saved for months to buy the used motorcycle that had caught the officer's attention. "I've been stopped 3 times since I got it," he admitted. "But never like that. They made me feel like a criminal just for riding it." Maggie listened, recognizing the pattern. Young Latino man on an expensive-looking motorcycle, assumptions made, guilt presumed, intimidation employed as standard procedure. "What you did?" Jesse shook his head. "Nobody's ever stood up for me like that. Most people just look away." "I know what that feels like," Maggie said. "The looking away part." As Jesse prepared to leave, he reached for his wallet. Maggie waved him off. "It's on the house today. I can't let you do that. You've already done enough. Consider it my apology for how you were treated in our town." Jesse hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'm part of a motorcycle club in Riverdale. Nothing crazy, just enthusiasts who ride together on weekends. If you ever need anything, anything at all, call this number." Maggie took the card, tucking it into her apron pocket without really looking at it. "Ride safe, Jesse." As she watched him pull away, Maggie wondered if she'd made a powerful enemy in the local police department. The officers' faces, their barely concealed anger as the crowd gathered, suggested this wasn't over. Her food truck license was up for renewal next month. Health inspections could suddenly become more frequent and stringent. Parking regulations could be enforced with new zeal. Yet despite these concerns, she felt no regret. Some lines had to be drawn, some stands had to be taken, regardless of the cost. What Maggie couldn't possibly know was that the business card now sitting in her apron pocket would become her unexpected insurance policy, and that by this time tomorrow, Willow Creek would witness a show of solidarity unlike anything in the town's history. What would you have done in Maggie's situation? Have you ever witnessed someone being unfairly targeted by authority figures? Share your thoughts in the comments. Part 2, Jesse's story, first 600 words. Jesse Rodriguez had never been one to draw attention to himself. At 24, he moved through life with a quiet confidence that some mistook for shyness. His dark hair was always neatly trimmed, his clothes simple but well-maintained, jeans, work boots, and usually a plain t-shirt under a leather jacket when riding his motorcycle. What most people in Willow Creek didn't know, what Maggie Torres certainly didn't know when she intervened that morning, was that Jesse wasn't just any young mechanic passing through town. He was Jesse Rodriguez Rollins, son of Richard "Rich" Rollins, founder and president of the Iron Legacy Motorcycle Club. Jesse had deliberately dropped his father's surname when moving to Riverdale 3 years ago. Not out of shame or rebellion, but from a deep-seated desire to make his own way in the world, to be judged on his own merits rather than his father's reputation. Rich Rollins had founded the Iron Legacy MC 25 years earlier with a group of Vietnam veterans seeking brotherhood and purpose after returning to a country that often treated them with suspicion or outright hostility. What began as weekend rides and mutual support evolved into a legitimate organization with chapters across 3 states. Unlike the stereotypical image of motorcycle clubs portrayed in movies, Iron Legacy built its reputation on community service and veteran advocacy. They organized charity rides for children's hospitals, provided security for community events, and created a support network for veterans struggling with PTSD and reintegration. "We ride with purpose," was Rich's motto, emblazoned on the back of every club jacket alongside their emblem, a phoenix rising from ashes, symbolizing rebirth and transformation. Growing up as the son of the club's founder, Jesse had absorbed its core values: loyalty, integrity, service, and brotherhood. He'd witnessed firsthand how the members looked out for each other, how they stepped up when one of their own, or anyone in their community, needed help. He'd also seen how people's perceptions changed when they learned of his connection to the club. Some became overly friendly, hoping to gain favor. Others grew wary, influenced by media portrayals of motorcycle clubs as lawless gangs. Few saw him simply as Jesse. When he turned 21, Jesse made a decision that surprised many in the club. Rather than taking a leadership position in Iron Legacy as his father had hoped, he announced his intention to forge his own path. "I need to know who I am outside of your shadow, Dad," he explained during a difficult conversation in his father's garage. "I need to build something that's mine." Rich Rollins, a broad-shouldered man whose beard had long since turned gray, had studied his son for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Your grandfather told me something similar when I started the club," he finally said. "He wanted me to take over his construction business. I told him I needed to build my own legacy." He clasped Jesse's shoulder. "You'll always have a place here, son. But I respect you needing to find your own way." That conversation led Jesse to Riverdale, a town 40 miles from the Iron Legacy's home base. There, he secured an apprenticeship at Martinez Auto Shop, rented a small apartment above a hardware store, and began building the independent life he craved. Despite having access to his father's considerable resources, the Iron Legacy had grown into a legitimate business empire. With investments in real estate and several legitimate businesses, Jesse chose to live on his mechanic's salary. His only indulgence was the motorcycle he'd saved for months to purchase, a used Harley-Davidson Softail that he'd lovingly restored himself. At Martinez Auto Shop, Jesse quickly proved himself to be more than just a pair of hands. His intuitive understanding of engines, combined with a meticulous attention to detail, made him invaluable. Within a year, he was handling the shop's most challenging repairs. By his second year, owner Miguel Martinez had offered him a partnership track. "You've got a gift, kid," Miguel told him. "And more importantly, you've got integrity. Customers trust you." That trust extended beyond the garage. Jesse volunteered at the local high school, teaching basic automotive maintenance to students. He helped elderly neighbors with home repairs. He organized a tool-sharing program for the apartment complex where he lived, allowing residents to borrow equipment they couldn't afford to purchase. All of this he did quietly, without fanfare or expectation of recognition. When asked why he dedicated so much time to helping others, Jesse would shrug and say, "It's just how I was raised." Indeed, beneath his independent streak ran a deep current of values instilled by his father and the Iron Legacy Brotherhood. Service to community. Respect for others. standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. These principles were tested 6 months into his time in Riverdale, when Jesse witnessed a group of men harassing a homeless veteran outside the local grocery store. Without hesitation, he intervened, placing himself between the aggressors and their target. "This man served our country," Jesse said calmly but firmly. "He deserves your respect, not your mockery." The confrontation might have turned violent if not for the arrival of Miguel Martinez, who happened to be passing by. Together, they defused the situation and helped the veteran, James, find temporary shelter and eventually connect with VA services. Word of Jesse's actions spread through Riverdale's tight-knit community. Though he downplayed what he'd done, the incident cemented his reputation as someone who lived by a code of honor. What few people realized was how carefully Jesse navigated his dual identity. In Riverdale, he was simply Jesse Rodriguez, the skilled young mechanic with a kind heart. Only Miguel Martinez knew his full background, having recognized Rich Rollins when he visited the shop one day. "Your secret's safe with me," Miguel assured him. "But I gotta ask, why hide it? The Iron Legacy does good work. Your father's respected." Jesse's answer revealed the complexity of his journey. "I'm proud of my father and what he's built. But I need to know that what I build is mine. That people see me for me, not as Rich Rollins' son." This desire for authentic connection led Jesse to establish a routine that brought him through Willow Creek twice weekly. The town lay between Riverdale and a parts supplier Jesse frequented for specialty components. Though he could have taken the highway and bypassed Willow Creek entirely, he preferred the scenic route that took him down Main Street. Initially, he stopped at Maggie's food truck simply because it was convenient, good food served quickly by someone who treated everyone with equal warmth. Over time, however, it became a highlight of his journey. Maggie's genuine interest in her customers, her work ethic, and her obvious pride in her business resonated with Jesse's own values. He never mentioned his background to her. He never dropped hints about his father's influence or the resources he could access if he chose. In Maggie's eyes, he was just another customer, and that anonymity felt like freedom. What Jesse didn't realize was how closely his path mirrored Maggie's own journey. Both had walked away from security to build something authentic. Both valued independence but remained deeply connected to their roots. Both lived by principles that sometimes put them at odds with those in positions of power. Perhaps this unconscious recognition explained why Jesse felt so comfortable at Maggie's food truck. Though their interactions rarely went beyond friendly small talk, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect between two people who chose to define success on their own terms. On the morning of the confrontation, Jesse hadn't planned to stop in Willow Creek. He was running late for a meeting with an important client and had only pulled into the gas station to refuel. The police cruisers that appeared seemingly out of nowhere caught him by surprise. This wasn't Jesse's first experience with law enforcement profiling. Despite his careful adherence to traffic laws when riding his motorcycle, he'd been stopped multiple times, usually with vague explanations about routine checks or matching a description. His father had warned him about this reality years ago. "Some people see the bike first and the man second," Rich had explained. "It doesn't matter how you dress or how you behave. To them, motorcycle equals trouble." Jesse had developed a standard approach to these encounters: respectful compliance, minimal information, no sudden movements. Usually, this strategy resulted in a brief delay before being sent on his way with a warning to ride safe. But the officers who stopped him in Willow Creek that morning were different. Their questioning was more aggressive, their assumptions more blatant, their intimidation tactics more pronounced. When they suggested his motorcycle might be stolen, Jesse realized this wasn't a routine stop but something potentially more serious. For a brief moment, he considered revealing his full identity. The Rollins name carried weight in motorcycle circles, and Iron Legacy had members in law enforcement across the region. One phone call to his father would likely end the harassment immediately. But that would mean leveraging his father's influence, the very thing he'd moved to Riverdale to avoid. It would mean admitting he couldn't handle the situation on his own. It would mean returning to being Rich Rollins' son rather than his own man. So instead, Jesse continued his strategy of polite compliance, repeatedly offering to show his registration and proof of purchase, keeping his voice level despite the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. When the officers positioned themselves to block any potential exit, he felt a flash of genuine fear. That's when Maggie Torres stepped into the confrontation. Jesse had recognized her immediately, the food truck owner whose breakfast burritos had become a highlight of his trips through Willow Creek. Her claim that he was a regular customer surprised him, but he quickly understood she was creating a connection to justify her intervention. As she stood her ground against the officers, Jesse witnessed something he'd previously only seen within the Iron Legacy Brotherhood, someone willing to risk their own security to protect a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. By noon, the story had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. In a town of just under 15,000 people, news traveled fast, especially news involving a confrontation with local law enforcement. Social media accelerated the process, with several bystanders having posted videos of Maggie standing her ground as the officers eventually backed down. "Did you hear about Maggie from the food truck? I was there. She just walked right up to them. My cousin said the cops were hassling some kid for no reason. Always knew she had backbone, but that took guts." The lunch rush at Maggie's Meals on Wheels was unlike anything she'd experienced before. Regular customers arrived with words of support. Strangers appeared, curious to see the woman from the videos. Some came specifically to thank her. "My son gets stopped all the time in his friend's car," confided a middle-aged woman who ordered a sandwich she didn't really want. "Nobody ever steps up like you did." Not all reactions were positive. A group of men in business attire who normally frequented her truck walked past with pointed glances, choosing to eat elsewhere. A woman Maggie recognized from town council meetings shook her head disapprovingly while waiting for her order. "You're making enemies in high places," she warned in a low voice. "Those officers have friends." Miguel, working the grill beside Maggie, kept shooting her concerned glances. "Maybe we should close early today," he suggested as the afternoon wore on. "Give things time to cool down." Maggie shook her head. "We don't close until 5. Same as always." Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from friends who'd seen the videos or heard the stories. Her sister called 3 times before Maggie could step away long enough to answer. "Are you crazy?" Elena demanded without preamble. "You can't just confront cops like that." "I didn't confront them," Maggie corrected. "I asked legitimate questions about whether they were detaining someone or not. While shouting for witnesses and getting everyone to record it." "Dios mío, Maggie, haven't you learned? This is how you lost your job at Hartman." The parallel wasn't lost on Maggie. Standing up against authority figures who misused their power had cost her once before. It might cost her again. The difference was that this time, the potential consequences were even more immediate. Her food truck license. Her parking permit. Her health inspections. All could become weapons if the police department decided to make an example of her. Yet despite these concerns, Maggie felt a strange sense of peace. The knot of anxiety that had formed in her stomach during the confrontation had loosened, replaced by a quiet certainty that she'd done the right thing. "Some things matter more than playing it safe, Elena," she told her sister. "You didn't see how they were treating him. Like he was guilty just for existing. And it had to be you who stepped in. With everything you've worked for at stake." Maggie watched a young couple approach her truck, smiling and giving her a thumbs up. "If not me, then who?" By closing time, Maggie had served more customers than on any previous Tuesday in memory. Her supplies were nearly depleted, and her feet ached from hours of standing. Yet as she wiped down counters and tallied receipts, the exhaustion felt different, purposeful rather than merely tiring. As Miguel helped her close up, he finally voiced the question that had been on his mind all day. "Do you regret it? Getting involved?" Maggie paused, considering the question seriously. "No," she finally said. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't. That young man, Jesse, he was scared. They were intimidating him because they could, not because they had reason to. My brother got arrested last year for looking suspicious while waiting for a bus, Miguel said quietly. Nobody stepped in for him. The simple statement reinforced Maggie's conviction. This wasn't just about one incident or one young man. It was about a pattern that affected countless people who lacked the power or privilege to defend themselves. As she drove home that evening, Maggie noticed a police cruiser following her for several blocks before turning off. Coincidence, perhaps, but the message felt clear: we're watching you. At home, she found 3 voicemails waiting. The first was from Mayor Thompson, carefully worded to neither condemn nor support her actions, but expressing concern about tensions between local businesses and law enforcement. The second was from a local reporter seeking comment for a story. The third was from her landlord, reminding her that her lease specified no activities that might disrupt business operations in the area. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the weight of potential consequences finally settling on her shoulders. She'd built her business from nothing after losing everything. Now it was all at risk again. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Thank you for what you did today. You're not alone." Then another: "My daughter showed me the video. Proud to have you in our community." More messages followed, some from numbers she recognized, others from strangers who had somehow obtained her contact information. Words of support, gratitude, and encouragement flowed in, creating a virtual community of allies. One text in particular caught her attention: "Ms. Torres, this is Jesse Rodriguez from this morning. I wanted to thank you again and make sure you're okay. Please let me know if you experience any problems because of what happened." Maggie smiled, typing back, "I'm fine. Would do it again in a heartbeat." As she prepared for bed, Maggie remembered the business card Jesse had given her, still tucked in her apron pocket. She retrieved it, reading the simple text: "Iron Legacy MC," with a phone number and the club's phoenix emblem. A motorcycle club. Interesting that Jesse was a member. He seemed so quiet, so unassuming. She placed the card on her refrigerator with a magnet, not thinking much of it beyond a nice gesture from a grateful young man. What Maggie couldn't know was that at that very moment, Jesse Rodriguez was making a phone call that would mobilize one of the most respected motorcycle clubs in the region, and that by morning, her act of courage would be repaid in a way she never could have imagined. Maggie arrived at her food truck earlier than usual the next morning, half expecting to find a parking ticket or some other form of official harassment. Instead, the street was quiet, the early dawn painting Willow Creek in soft golden light. She began her preparations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that had settled in her stomach overnight. By 7:15, her first customers began to arrive, the usual early birds seeking coffee and breakfast before work. Several mentioned yesterday's incident, offering words of support or simply nodding in approval. Others seemed deliberately casual, perhaps not wanting to take sides in what was becoming a divisive town issue. At 8:30, Maggie was handing change to a customer when she heard it, a distant rumble that gradually grew louder. At first, she thought it might be a freight train passing through the outskirts of town, but the sound was different. More organic. More purposeful. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. They appeared at the far end of Main Street, a coordinated procession of gleaming machines moving in perfect formation. Leading the group was a rider on a vintage Harley-Davidson, his silver hair visible beneath his helmet. Behind him came row after row of motorcycles, their riders wearing matching leather vests emblazoned with a phoenix emblem. The Iron Legacy Motorcycle Club had arrived in Willow Creek. Maggie watched, momentarily frozen, as the procession approached. Her customers stepped back from the truck, some with expressions of concern, others with undisguised curiosity. Across the street, shopkeepers emerged from their businesses. A police cruiser that had been parked at the corner pulled away with surprising haste. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, directed the others with hand signals. With military precision, the motorcycles parked in a semicircle around the town square, creating a perimeter that was somehow both organized and imposing. As the engines fell silent, the leader removed his helmet and surveyed the area. His eyes, sharp and assessing, found Maggie's food truck. With a nod to his companions, he strode purposefully toward her, his boots striking the pavement with authority. "Miss Torres?" His voice was deep, resonant with natural command. Maggie straightened her shoulders. "Yes. Richard Rollins." He extended a weathered hand. "Though most folks call me Rich. I believe you met my son yesterday." Understanding dawned on Maggie. "Jesse. The business card. The motorcycle club. Mr. Rollins, My son called me last night," Rich continued. "Told me about a food truck owner who stood up for him when nobody else would. Told me she risked her business to make sure he was treated fairly." His expression softened slightly. "That kind of courage deserves recognition." Before Maggie could respond, Rich turned to address the gathered bikers, who had formed a loose semicircle behind him. "This is Maggie Torres. Yesterday, when two officers were hassling Jesse for no good reason, she stepped in. Stood her ground. Made sure people were watching and recording. Made sure my boy was treated right." A murmur of approval rippled through the group. "Today," Rich continued, "we're here to show Ms. Torres that when you stand up for one of ours, we stand up for you." With that simple declaration, the atmosphere in the town square transformed. The bikers, nearly 50 in total, formed an orderly line at Maggie's food truck. Each ordered breakfast, paid in cash, and left tips that made Maggie's eyes widen. Some introduced themselves, others simply nodded respectfully. All treated her with a deference that suggested she had earned something precious, their respect. As the line progressed, Maggie spotted Jesse near the back, looking simultaneously embarrassed and proud. When he reached the counter, he gave her a sheepish smile. "I hope this is okay," he said quietly. "When I told my dad what happened, he insisted on coming to thank you personally. I didn't expect him to bring the whole chapter." Maggie arrived at her food truck earlier than usual the next morning, half expecting to find a parking ticket or some other form of official harassment. Instead, the street was quiet, the early dawn painting Willow Creek in soft golden light. She began her preparations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that had settled in her stomach overnight. By 7:15, her first customers began to arrive, the usual early birds seeking coffee and breakfast before work. Several mentioned yesterday's incident, offering words of support or simply nodding in approval. Others seemed deliberately casual, perhaps not wanting to take sides in what was becoming a divisive town issue. At 8:30, Maggie was handing change to a customer when she heard it, a distant rumble that gradually grew louder. At first, she thought it might be a freight train passing through the outskirts of town, but the sound was different. More organic. More purposeful. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. They appeared at the far end of Main Street, a coordinated procession of gleaming machines moving in perfect formation. Leading the group was a rider on a vintage Harley-Davidson, his silver hair visible beneath his helmet. Behind him came row after row of motorcycles, their riders wearing matching leather vests emblazoned with a phoenix emblem. The Iron Legacy Motorcycle Club had arrived in Willow Creek. Maggie watched, momentarily frozen, as the procession approached. Her customers stepped back from the truck, some with expressions of concern, others with undisguised curiosity. Across the street, shopkeepers emerged from their businesses. A police cruiser that had been parked at the corner pulled away with surprising haste. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, directed the others with hand signals. With military precision, the motorcycles parked in a semicircle around the town square, creating a perimeter that was somehow both organized and imposing. As the engines fell silent, the leader removed his helmet and surveyed the area. His eyes, sharp and assessing, found Maggie's food truck. With a nod to his companions, he strode purposefully toward her, his boots striking the pavement with authority. "Miss Torres?" His voice was deep, resonant with natural command. Maggie straightened her shoulders. "Yes. Richard Rollins." He extended a weathered hand. "Though most folks call me Rich. I believe you met my son yesterday." Understanding dawned on Maggie. "Jesse. The business card. The motorcycle club. Mr. Rollins, My son called me last night," Rich continued. "Told me about a food truck owner who stood up for him when nobody else would. Told me she risked her business to make sure he was treated fairly." His expression softened slightly. "That kind of courage deserves recognition." Before Maggie could respond, Rich turned to address the gathered bikers, who had formed a loose semicircle behind him. "This is Maggie Torres. Yesterday, when two officers were hassling Jesse for no good reason, she stepped in. Stood her ground. Made sure people were watching and recording. Made sure my boy was treated right." A murmur of approval rippled through the group. "Today," Rich continued, "we're here to show Ms. Torres that when you stand up for one of ours, we stand up for you." With that simple declaration, the atmosphere in the town square transformed. The bikers, nearly 50 in total, formed an orderly line at Maggie's food truck. Each ordered breakfast, paid in cash, and left tips that made Maggie's eyes widen. Some introduced themselves, others simply nodded respectfully. All treated her with a deference that suggested she had earned something precious, their respect. As the line progressed, Maggie spotted Jesse near the back, looking simultaneously embarrassed and proud. When he reached the counter, he gave her a sheepish smile. "I hope this is okay," he said quietly. "When I told my dad what happened, he insisted on coming to thank you personally. I didn't expect him to bring the whole chapter." As the afternoon progressed, the gathering in the town square took on an almost festival-like quality. Several bikers had walked to nearby shops, returning with additional food and drinks to share. A trio of club members with musical backgrounds had set up an impromptu performance area, playing acoustic versions of classic rock songs that drew appreciative audiences. What struck Maggie most was the deliberate way the Iron Legacy members engaged with the community. They spoke with shopkeepers, helped an elderly woman carry groceries, and even organized an impromptu motorcycle safety demonstration for fascinated children, with parents' permission. It was a calculated charm offensive, and it was working. "They're not what I expected," Miguel admitted as he worked alongside Maggie. "My cousin was in a club in California. Nothing like this." "There are different kinds," Maggie replied, remembering Rich's careful distinction between clubs and gangs. "I think they're making a point." By 3 o'clock, Mayor Thompson finally made an appearance, flanked by 2 town council members. His expression suggested he was torn between concern about the unexpected gathering and recognition of its peaceful nature. Rich Rollins spotted him immediately and approached with extended hand. Their conversation, though too distant for Maggie to hear clearly, appeared cordial if somewhat tense. The mayor gestured several times toward the gathered motorcycles, while Rich responded with calm assurance. After several minutes, they shook hands again, and the mayor departed looking thoughtful. "What was that about?" Maggie asked when Rich returned to her truck for coffee. "Just establishing parameters," Rich replied with a slight smile. "Making sure the mayor understands we're here as peaceful visitors supporting a local business. And that we'll be back regularly to check on our friend." The implication was clear: Iron Legacy was establishing a presence in Willow Creek, not as intimidation, but as a reminder that Maggie had powerful allies. As 5 o'clock approached, Maggie's usual closing time, Rich signaled to his members. With the same discipline they'd shown upon arrival, the bikers began preparing to depart. They collected trash, returned borrowed chairs to nearby businesses, and thanked locals for their hospitality. Before mounting his motorcycle, Rich approached Maggie one last time. "We'll be back next Wednesday," he said. "Probably not the whole chapter, but enough to make our presence known." If you have any trouble before then, any at all, you call. Maggie touched the phoenix pin she'd attached to her collar. I will. And thank you, Mr. Rollins. For everything. Rich, he corrected with a smile. And thank you for being the kind of person who doesn't look away when it matters. With a final nod, he returned to his motorcycle. Minutes later, the Iron Legacy Motorcycle Club departed as they had arrived, in formation, with purpose and dignity. As the rumble of engines faded, Maggie surveyed the town square. Several locals remained, discussing the day's events with animated expressions. A few approached her truck, some for the first time, curious about the woman who had earned such dramatic support. Been meaning to try your food for months, admitted a man Maggie recognized as the hardware store owner. Guess today was the day. As she began closing procedures, Maggie noticed a police cruiser slowly circling the square. Officer Brennan, one of the two who had confronted Jesse, was behind the wheel, his expression unreadable as he drove past. Maggie met his gaze steadily, the phoenix pin catching the late afternoon sunlight. The message was silent but clear, the dynamics in Willow Creek had shifted. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The ripple effects of her choice had become a wave, changing not just her life but the fabric of the community itself. In the weeks following the Iron Legacy's visit, Willow Creek experienced a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The motorcycle club kept their promise, returning each Wednesday in smaller numbers, usually 10 to 15 riders, to patronize Maggie's food truck and maintain a visible presence in the town square. What began as an intimidating display of solidarity evolved into something unexpected: integration. Local residents, initially wary of the leather-clad visitors, gradually engaged with them, discovering that beneath the imposing exterior were men and women with families, jobs, and values not so different from their own. "They're actually really nice," Maggie overheard Mrs. Abernathy telling a friend at the farmer's market. "Did you know they organize toy drives for children's hospitals every Christmas? And Richard, their president, he's a retired Marine Corps officer." This revelation about Rich Rollins spread quickly through town, adding a layer of respectability to the club's reputation. But it was the truth about Jesse Rodriguez that truly shifted perceptions. The story emerged during the third Wednesday visit, when Jesse arrived not on his motorcycle but in a silver Tesla, wearing a tailored suit instead of riding leathers. He parked near the square, nodding to several Iron Legacy members before approaching Maggie's truck. "Dr. Rodriguez," exclaimed Principal Winters, who was waiting in line. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jesse smiled. "Just grabbing lunch, like everyone else." The principal turned to Maggie. "Dr. Rodriguez is the new pediatric surgeon at Riverside Memorial. He's been volunteering at our career day events. The students adore him." Maggie raised an eyebrow at Jesse, who shrugged with a hint of embarrassment. "I wear different hats," he explained. "The club was my father's legacy, a way to honor his service values outside the military. The medicine is mine." Word spread rapidly that the young man Maggie had defended, the one officers Brennan and Michaels had treated with such suspicion, was not only a respected physician but the son of a decorated veteran. The revelation forced many in Willow Creek to confront their own biases about appearance and identity. Even the police department felt the pressure of changing perceptions. Chief Williams issued a public statement about community-oriented policing initiatives and building trust through transparency. Officers Brennan and Michaels were conspicuously assigned to community outreach programs. Their encounters with citizens were now frequently recorded on body cameras that had been in procurement for months but suddenly became operational. For Maggie, the most profound change was personal. Her business flourished as her food truck became something of a local landmark, the place where courage had created community. But beyond financial success, she found herself at the center of a network of relationships that transcended Willow Creek's traditional social boundaries. "You created a bridge," Jesse told her one afternoon as they shared coffee after the lunch rush. "Between people who would never have connected otherwise. Between what this town was and what it could be." Maggie shook her head. I just couldn't watch them treat you that way. That's exactly the point, Jesse replied. Most people can watch injustice happen. They've trained themselves to look away, to mind their own business. You chose differently. As summer turned to fall, the story of Maggie Torres and the Iron Legacy became part of Willow Creek's unofficial history, a modern parable about judgment, courage, and the unexpected ways communities can heal and grow. The phoenix pin remained on Maggie's collar, a small but visible reminder that standing up for what's right, even when frightening, can catalyze change far beyond one moment or one person. In that ordinary town square, through one extraordinary choice, Maggie had demonstrated what true courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. Has someone ever stood up for you when no one else would? Or have you been the one person willing to speak up when everyone else stayed silent? Share your story below and don't forget to like and subscribe to Courage Core Stories for more tales of everyday heroes who remind us what true courage looks like.